Trigger warning, this video contains reality and may be extremely upsetting to the very sensitive. Viewer discretion is advised. Slavery is quite an upsetting topic for many. In school, I started learning about African slavery at a very young age. I think I was first taught about it in grade 3. When Black History Month rolled around, my black teacher, Miss Davis, ranted about how whites enslaved blacks and how we should feel bad. Later on, in grade 6, they made us read this book in class about an African slave girl who was taken from her homeland by white slave owners to be abused by southern redneck slave masters. Miss Davis, other black activists, and my school history books were quite inaccurate. Unfortunately, many white people are infected by this mental disease known as white guilt. Many black activists and guilty whites outright deny that Africans sold their own people into slavery, even though there is a lot of undeniable evidence. In fact, Africans were enslaving each other for thousands of years, even before the US was formed, and many countries in Africa still practice slavery today. Tipu Tip was a world-famous black slave trader in Zanzibar. The Leo people captured other Africans in war and sold them into slavery. Barack Obama himself descended from the Leo people, by the way. There are in fact more Africans enslaved in Africa today than in all of US history. In the last decade, slavery in Sudan has made a comeback. Despite the suspension of the capture of Sudanese slaves as a result of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement of 2005, over 35,000 slaves remain in bondage in northern Sudan. According to the American Anti-Slavery Group, black Africans in southern Sudan have been abducted for centuries in the Arab slave trade. Government-armed Arab militias are known to kill the men and enslave the women and children as personal property, or to march them north to be auctioned and sold. In Mauritania, slavery persists even though the government repeatedly banned it. It's unknown exactly how many Africans are enslaved in this country. Estimates range wildly. At least 90,000 darker-skinned Africans still live as the property of the Muslim Berber communities. Other estimates, perhaps using a broader definition, claim up to 600,000 men, women, and children, or 20% of the population, are slaves to North African Arabs. This percentage of slaves is the highest in the world. Sex slavery is a huge problem in many African countries like South Africa, Liberia, Sierra Leone, northern Uganda, Congo, Niger, and Mauritania and Sudan, as I mentioned above. In Ghana, Togo, and Benin, a form of religious forced prostitution known as Trosi forcibly keeps thousands of girls and women in traditional shrines as wives to the gods, where priests perform the sexual function in place of the gods. And it's not only Africans being enslaved in Africa. Many Chinese prostitutes are trafficked into Ghana to service communities in the country. Victims are recruited under the guise of working as restaurant assistants. They are then confined and forced to provide sexual services. Children are also victims of slavery in Africa today. Children are kidnapped and sold for $20 to $70 each. They are sold into sex dens or as unpaid domestic servants in wealthier oil-rich states, such as Nigeria and Gabon. At least white countries outlawed slavery a long time ago. Slavery is still practiced in Africa today despite efforts to ban it, and it was practiced hundreds of years ago. The United Nations estimate that roughly 27 to 30 million people are enslaved today around the world. In 1990, the Human Rights Watch reported that routine slave punishments for the slightest fault include beatings, denial of food, and prolonged exposure to the sun with hands and feet tied together. Serious infringement of the master's rule were met with a variety of tortures, including insect treatment where tiny ants were stuffed into the victim's ears, which are sealed with rocks and bound with a scarf. Hands and feet are tied and the errant slave is left for days, after which the rights group reports he will do what is told. If you still don't believe me, I have sources in the description below. Whites were actually the first people to stop slavery in modern times, yet white people are exclusively blamed for historical slavery. In the 16th and 18th century, Africans enslaved 1.5 million white Europeans in the Barbary slave trade, yet you don't hear white people crying out for reparations. African Muslims raided up the coastlines of Europe, kidnapping and enslaving white European Christians. The men were galley slaves and the women were sex slaves. This was way more brutal than working on a plantation or as a domestic servant. When I was younger, I would hear about whites literally going into Africa and rounding up the slaves, but that was not true at all. Nearly all modern historians agree that European slave traders always bought slaves from the African vendors at coastal markets. Europeans didn't even have to get off their ships to buy slaves. It was like going into the McDonald's drive-thru. Those slaves are already at the slave market in chains ready to go. We hear about the brutal Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean, but never hear about the estimated 10 million so indigenous Africans who perished while being marched to sea, in chains and yokes by their African captors. Now let's talk about slavery in America. Of the 10 to 15 million Africans who were transplanted into the New World, no more than 6% or around 400,000 went to the Northern Hemisphere. Almost all of them went into South America. So that means about 94% of slaves were transported across the Atlantic to serve Hispanic slave owners. But we don't look at Hispanics as evil slave owners. At the peak of black slavery in the South, only 5% of Southern whites owned slaves. If you include the white people of the North, it means only 1.4% of white Americans owned slaves. Jewish Americans were the biggest slave owners in America per capita, but Native Americans and other blacks owned slaves in America as well. In fact, the first slave owner in the 1600s, USA, was a black man named Anthony Johnson. An estimated 3,000 blacks owned a total of 20,000 slaves in the year 1860 in America. One study concluded that 28% of free blacks owned slaves, which was a far higher percentage than that of free whites. Through my research, I was constantly wondering, why don't black activists ever talk about this shit? It seems like the majority of the population has no concept of history or facts, due to the media and our schools censoring reality. Through telling the lie of the white slave trade, they have installed crippling guilt into the white population. Guilt is a very powerful historical weapon used to weaken and demoralize the people. In history, all races have done terrible shit. We should not be guilted by the mistakes of our ancestors. I hope that after this video, the white people watching don't feel that guilty anymore. Thanks for watching, guys, and stay sane.